All right, so picture this. You're 3, right? And your mom tells you to behave.
Okay.
And what do you say back? I am have. Pretty clever for a 3-year-old.
Yeah.
That was David Foster Wallace. And it kind of makes you wonder, was this, like, early genius a sign of things to come?
It's definitely a fascinating glimpse into his mind, even at that age. I mean, the way he played with language, it's not typical.
No, not at all. And that's what we're diving into today on the Mad Genius Thesis, the possible link between, being super creative and mental illness.
It's a question that's been around forever. Like, are these things connected somehow?
Exactly. And with David Foster Wallace, it's especially interesting.
Yeah, for sure. And that anecdote you mentioned about I Am Have, it's from D.T. Max's biography, Every Love Story is a Ghost Story, which, we're using as our main source today.
Right. Max really dives deep into Wallace's life, and it's not just like a sad story. I mean, the book shows this incredible family environment where, like, intellectual playfulness was just normal.
Absolutely. Like that thing with substituting 3.14159 for pi on car trips.
Yeah, that's such a Wallace family thing. It shows how language wasn't just a tool for them. It was something to, like, have fun with.
Totally. And you can see how that kind of constant wordplay might have influenced his writing style later on.
Oh, yeah, for sure. His writing can be super dense and intricate, like he's crafting these elaborate puzzles with words.
Definitely. But the question is, did this, intense focus on language end up being a good thing or a bad thing for him?
Right. Like, did it play a role in his struggles with mental health? It's a tough question.
It is. It's tempting to draw a straight line from his childhood to his mental health, but it's probably more complicated than that. I mean, he wasn't just a product of his upbringing, right?
No, of course not. He was his own person with his own internal world. So what else was going on with him, like outside of his family?
Well, even as a kid, he was obviously really bright, won an essay contest at 14, did great in school,
Wow.
But at the same time, he had trouble fitting in, feeling like an outsider, even around other smart kids.
And that feeling, like being different, that seems to pop up a lot in his life and his writing, right?
Definitely. It makes you wonder if that, not belonging, if that pushed him towards writing as a way to connect.
It's possible. Writing can be a way to communicate, even when you feel isolated. And for Wallace, who was already so into language, it makes sense.
Yeah, it was a natural outlet for him.
And we can't forget about tennis. Like, he wasn't just messing around, he was good.
Yeah. I mean, he wasn't the most naturally gifted athlete, but he was strategic. He used his analytical skills to his advantage.
So, like, he studied the game, analyzed his opponents, and kind of, like, outsmarted them.
Exactly. It's like he brought that same intellectual intensity to tennis that he brought to writing.
That's interesting. So we see these different sides to him. The language whiz, the analytical mind, the social awkwardness, and then there's marijuana.
Right.
How much of a role did that play in his early life?
That's a tough one to answer definitively. It's clear that it became a pattern for him, a way to cope, maybe.
Yeah.
Some people might say it helped his creativity, while others might say it made his anxiety worse.
It's kind of like that whole debate about the mad genius, right?
Yeah.
Did marijuana unlock his potential, or did it lead him down a darker path? I guess that's something we'll keep thinking about as we go.
Yeah, I think we will. But for now, let's follow him to Amherst College. That's where things start to get really interesting.
Okay, Amherst, famous for all those great minds that came out of there. What was Wallace's experience like?
Intense. He was a really driven student, pushing himself hard academically.
And marijuana was still part of the picture.
Yeah, definitely. He'd pull all-nighters in the library, fueled by ambition and, probably some marijuana.
It's like he was trying to prove something maybe to himself as much as anyone else.
Right, exactly. But even with all that success, he still felt like an outsider. He connected with other students who felt the same way, like his friend Mark Costello.
That's interesting. So even surrounded by other brilliant people, he still felt different.
Yeah, both he and Costello felt this kind of disconnect between where they came from and the, more privileged world of Amherst.
Yeah, I can see how that would be tough, especially for someone as sensitive as Wallace.
It was. And it probably drew him to philosophy, those deep questions about life and meaning.
Yeah, especially Professor Koenig's classes, right?
Yes. Koenig's classes really emphasized original thinking and writing. That definitely resonated with Wallace.
It's like he was training himself to be this master of language, meticulously crafting his thoughts through writing.
Absolutely. And it paid off. He was doing great academically. But then things took a turn.
What happened?
During his sophomore year, he had a complete breakdown, a major mental breakdown. He had to leave Amherst.
Wow, that's heavy. So here's this incredible mind achieving all this success, and then he's hit with something much bigger than just grades and academics.
Right. And this experience, this descent into depression, it would really shape his writing. You can see it in his story, The Planet Trilithon, as it stands in relation to the bad thing.
That story is so powerful, especially that one line about depression. Imagine that every single atom and every single cell in your body is as sick as that nauseated stomach. Just gets to you.
It's so raw and honest. That ability to capture human suffering, especially the mental and emotional kind, is a big part of what makes his writing so impactful.
And it came from a very real place, his own experiences. So it makes you wonder, did his breakdown, as awful as it was, actually fuel his creativity?
That's a really hard question to answer, but it's clear that it was a turning point in his life. It changed him profoundly.
So we left off with Wallace at this, crossroads in his life. He'd had this major breakdown, had to leave Amherst. It really shows you, that mental illness can affect anyone, even brilliant minds like his.
Yeah, it's a good reminder. And as we look at what happens next in his life, we can see how this whole experience really shaped him, his path, both personally and as a writer.
Right. So he goes back to Amherst eventually, finishes his degree, but something's different.
Yeah, it's like he's carrying this weight now, this understanding of how fragile the mind can be. But at the same time, he's still driven. He graduates summa cum laude, even wins an award for his work in economics, and that wasn't even his main thing.
Wow, economics. That's impressive.
It really is. It shows his resilience and how smart he was. But it's also during this time that he starts working on his undergraduate thesis, which would later turn into his first novel, The Broom of the System.
Oh, yeah, Broom of the System. That book is a trip. It's dense and philosophical, but also kind of playful. You can totally see Wittgenstein's influence there, right?
Oh, absolutely. Wittgenstein was all about how language doesn't just reflect reality, it actually shapes how we understand it. And Broom of the System really grapples with that idea, like how language can make things clearer, but also sometimes more confusing.
It's like a game he's playing with the reader.
Exactly. And he does it with this wicked sense of humor. Remember that scene where the protagonist's grandmother disappears in the nursing home, and then she's found quoting Wittgenstein?
Oh, yeah. That was classic Wallace, mixing high-level intellectual stuff with this playful irony.
Totally. But under all that, there's this real anxiety about the power of language, like how it can almost control our thoughts.
That's deep. So, okay, we have this amazing first novel showing off his skills. What's next for him?
Well, he heads off to the University of Arizona. He's going for his MFA.
Interesting. From Amherst to Arizona. That's quite a change.
It is. He's moving from this structured intellectual world to something way more experimental, more free-flowing.
Ah, the classic MFA experience. And of course, no Wallace story would be complete without some complicated romance.
Right. Enter Gail Walden. She was a poet, and she represented everything Wallace's background hadn't prepared him for.
Oh, this is going to be good.
Oh, it is. She was into astrology, tarot cards, a much more intuitive, emotional approach to life and art. Totally different from Wallace's logical academic world.
Opposites attract, right?
Yeah.
But this wasn't just a fling, was it?
No, it was intense, passionate, and honestly, pretty messy in the end.
I can see that. It sounds like Wallace, with all his issues, wasn't quite ready for that kind of intense connection.
Yeah, I think you're right. He wanted closeness, but he was also afraid of it. He had this pattern of pushing people away.
Wow, that's tough. And it's around this time that he really gets into postmodernism and metafiction.
Yes. He starts experimenting with unconventional storytelling, playing with the lines between reality and fiction.
As breaking all the rules.
Kind of. Postmodernism is all about questioning those traditional ideas of storytelling. It embraces ambiguity and irony, and metafiction takes it even further, making the reader aware that they're reading a made-up story.
That's a lot to wrap your head around.
It is. But Wallace did it brilliantly. His short story collection from this period, Girl with Curious Hair, is a great example of this new style. It's a wild ride through media, celebrity, relationships, all with his trademark wit and honesty.
Girl with Curious Hair. I need to check that out.
You should. There's this one story, Little Expressionless Animals. It's about a woman who's unbeatable on Jeopardy, but chooses love over fame. It's about how we get so caught up in achievement and entertainment that we forget about human connection.
That's pretty relevant, even today. It's like he's warning us about the dangers of getting Too detached, too ironic, too lost in this artificial world.
Exactly. He's trying to figure out how to find real meaning in a world that often feels shallow and isolating. And that's a theme that keeps coming up in his work.
It's a big question, for sure. But he wasn't just writing short stories in Arizona. He also wrote Lyndon, right? About Lyndon B. Johnson.
Yes. That was another ambitious project. It's fictionalized, but it really gets into LBJ's head, explores the burden of power and ambition. It shows how versatile Wallace was as a writer.
He could jump from game shows to presidents and somehow tie it all back to these big questions about what it means to be human.
Exactly. So we see Wallace's talent growing, his ambition too, but those personal struggles, they're still there. After Arizona, he ends up back in Boston, living with his friend Mark Costello, and his addiction gets worse.
That's rough. It sounds like a really difficult time.
It was. He was dealing with all this pressure, his artistic goals, his demons, trying to find his place. It all just kind of came to a head.
And it's out of all this that he writes, Westward, the course of empire takes its way. That story is almost like a metafictional attack on writing workshops. It's really dense and challenging, but it reflects how disillusioned he was with the literary world.
It's a fascinating piece. He's deconstructing storytelling conventions, almost like he's questioning his own role as a writer. Like, what's the point of fiction in a world that's already so full of media and superficiality?
It's a lot to process. But remember, while all this is going on, he's also working on this huge project, the novel that would become Infinite Jest.
Right. Talk about ambition. Infinite Jest is monumental in both size and scope. It deals with addiction, entertainment, family, the search for meaning in a world full of distractions. It's a book that demands your attention, makes you think, and rewards you with these moments of insight and dark humor.
It's a book that sticks with you, that's for sure. It captures that feeling of being overwhelmed by information, constantly needing stimulation, struggling to connect.
And that struggle, that yearning for connection, is something Wallace himself dealt with his whole life. His relationships with women were intense, often difficult, reflecting his own struggles with intimacy.
Yeah, he had those patterns of pushing people away. And then finally, after years of battling addiction, he gets help. He enters a halfway house in Boston called Granada House.
Right, this was a major turning point, but recovery wasn't easy.
Of course not. It's a lifelong process.
He had to face his demons, rebuild his life. It was a humbling experience, forcing him to rely on others.
So he had to shed all that intellectual armor and be vulnerable.
Exactly. And that honesty, that willingness to look inward, had a big impact on his writing. It's during this time that he writes his essay, E Unibus Plumam, Television and U.S. Fiction.
That's the one where he critiques how television has shaped American culture and literature. Right?
Yes. He argues that TV, with its focus on irony and detachment, has made writers afraid to deal with real emotion.
That's interesting. Like, we've become too cynical to connect with anything on a deeper level.
That's his argument. It's a harsh critique, but there's also this glimmer of hope in his work. Like, he still believed we could find a way out, reclaim our capacity for empathy and connection.
So we left off with Wallace in recovery at Granada House. A big turning point, but like you said, not an easy road.
No, definitely not. Sobriety was a constant struggle for him, like a daily battle. And that really affected how he saw things, both in life and in his writing.
Right. He often talked about how recovery wasn't about being perfectly happy, but more about learning to live with the tough stuff, the uncertainty of being human.
Exactly. It's about accepting that life is messy and complicated. And you can see this new perspective in his later work, especially in Infinite Jest. Like, the way he explores addiction, the search for meaning, it all takes on a deeper meaning when you consider what he was going through personally.
Yeah, Infinite Jest is a deep book, for sure. One thing that really struck me was how he portrayed boredom. It's not just about the characters being bored, but like this existential boredom, the kind that seemed to be everywhere in modern life.
Right, that feeling of emptiness that we try to fill with distractions, with entertainment, anything to avoid facing it. That was a huge theme for Wallace.
It's like he saw this boredom as a symptom of being disconnected from ourselves, from each other, from something bigger. And it wasn't just an Infinite Jest, right? He talks about this in other works too, like that essay, E Unibus Pluram.
Oh yeah, definitely. In that one, he's basically saying that television, with all its irony and detachment, has trained us to avoid real emotion, real meaning. Like, we're too cool to care anymore.
It's a pretty bleak view, but was he saying there's no hope?
I don't think so. I think he believed we could find a way out of this, that we could learn to be more present, more compassionate. He saw literature as a way to do that.
Interesting. So like Reading challenging books could help us break free from all that irony and cynicism.
Exactly. He thought that engaging with difficult ideas, with real human emotion, could help us reconnect with our shared humanity.
It's like a call to be more mindful, more intentional about how we live our lives.
Right. And this idea is really powerful in his Kenyon commencement address, the one that became This is Water. He's basically telling those graduates to choose what they pay attention to be present, to care about other people.
That's a message we all need to hear. And it's not just something he wrote about, it's something he tried to live, to find his own way to a more meaningful life.
Absolutely. And so after Infinite Jest, he makes this interesting move. He goes to Illinois State University. Kind of unexpected for a writer like him, don't you think?
Yeah, a little bit. Why there?
It seems like he wanted a change of pace, something quieter, farther from the pressures of the literary world.
And he seemed to find that in the Midwest.
Yeah.
He connected with his recovery group, embraced the small town life.
Yeah, he found community there, and it shows his humility. He wasn't acting like the famous writer. He was just another guy trying to stay sober to help others do the same.
That's really cool. And while he was teaching there, he was working on a new novel, right? The one that came out after he died, The Pale King.
Right. It's a totally different book from Infinite Jest. This one's about IRS agents, of all things.
IRS agents. That doesn't sound very exciting.
I know, right? But it's actually a really fascinating book. It's about boredom, bureaucracy, finding meaning in the everyday. It's a challenge to read, but it makes you think.
I have to check it out. And during this time, he finds love again, marries Karen Green.
Yeah, they seemed really happy together. He was finding some peace, some stability. But tragically, his mental health struggles never went away completely. He took his own life in 2008.
It was a huge loss. It reminds us that mental illness can be so powerful, even with support and love. Sometimes the darkness wins. But his work, it continues to inspire people.
Absolutely. He gave us a new way to see ourselves, to see the world. He made us confront those uncomfortable truths we often try to ignore.
He challenged us to be more present, more caring. And maybe, in doing that, he showed us a path to a more meaningful life. David Foster Wallace's story is a reminder that brilliance and vulnerability often go hand in hand. His struggle with mental illness ended tragically, but his legacy lives on.
He really pushed the boundaries of language, explored the depths of human experience, and even though we still don't have a clear answer about the link between creativity and mental illness, what's certain is that his life and his honesty have had a profound impact on literature and on everyone who reads his work.
He made us think, he made us feel, and he challenged us to be better, more connected human beings. And that's a powerful legacy to leave behind.